A few years ago, my dad bought a cemetery while I was still in middle school, and I ended up working there with him until I graduated from high school. My tasks involved taking care of the gardens, mowing the lawn, pulling weeds, and tending to the flower beds, among other things. Aside from a few times when shadows appeared in the corner of my eye or strange sounds echoed, the cemetery was a surprisingly peaceful place. What really messes with your head is the process of burying someone in the crypts. The first thing is to dig about 5 feet deep to reveal huge stone doors. After removing them, you descend into a small, cold, dark room. These crypts have space for 2 standard-sized coffins, 4 children's coffins, without a doubt the most challenging, or decades of cremated remains. In the 50s and 60s, it was common for families to buy a crypt for the entire family lineage, cremating and depositing the remains there. Some families simply placed the ashes and sealed the crypt, but others lit candles and left mementos, flowers, photos, and small personal items. Opening one of these crypts after more than 50 years is a terrifying experience. You come across melted candles and old photos of people long deceased. Plus, after descending into that room several times, you start to get a strange feeling. You're surrounded by bodies at the same level, and inevitably one day you'll be down there too. There was one time when my best friend and I got a summer job at the cemetery, earning some cash while we were juniors and seniors in high school. It was easy money, $5 an hour, and we basically mowed, pruned, and kept the place clean and tidy. We spent the summer sweeping leaves, digging holes, and riding around in a modified golf cart with tools in the back. There were plenty of wilted flowers to remove, and besides that, we came across empty liquor bottles, beer cans, and sadly, some used condoms. One widow left notes on her husband's grave, but most of them were unreadable, and there were always soaked teddy bears on the children's graves. Throwing those things away felt wrong, and believe me, it was worse than digging holes. Working in the rain was annoying, and it rained quite a bit, but in the end, it was a peaceful job, no pun intended. The strangest thing I saw was an old doll left in the cemetery. By itself, that wasn't scary, but what caught our attention was that it was completely burnt, as if someone had used a blowtorch on it. Plus, it had large iron nails driven where the eyes should have been. It was probably just a prank by some college students, or at least that's what we thought. Who knows, maybe it was my friend, but he never confessed. Seeing that scene early in the morning, when no one else was around, terrified me. But if I thought that was scary, there was something much worse that I found during that job. On a cloudy Saturday morning, I stumbled upon the naked body of a young woman, about my age. She had been left there with her arms carefully positioned at her sides. There were strangulation marks, and whoever killed her had also beaten her brutally. She was identified quickly, a student from a nearby high school, but her clothes were never found, and as far as I know, the case was never solved. My friend and I were interrogated by the police on 2 separate occasions, and to be honest, that was the scariest part, knowing that for a while we were suspects in a murder. Thankfully, we both had alibis and were cleared as suspects, and the police never bothered us again. I just hope she's at peace now. My name is Sarah. I'm 20 years old, and I'm from North Carolina. Last November, exactly 101 years after the armistice of World War I, my contemporary history class at Penn State took a trip to the Allied war cemeteries in France. I had never left the country before, except for a brief 2-day trip to Canada when I visited a cousin studying in Toronto. I was excited to explore the world beyond the east coast of the United States. I even learned a bit of French, taking a few online classes in basic conversation and how to ask for directions. Every new word I mastered and every tricky pronunciation I got right made me even more enthusiastic. When it was time to pack my bags and head to the airport, I was so excited I could hardly contain myself. But when we arrived, it wasn't quite the Parisian dream I had expected. Besides the terrible weather, the French can indeed be extremely rude to tourists, something I hadn't anticipated. It made me realize how polite people can be in the United States. Sure, there are those who say things like, "Speak English, this is America." But we certainly don't correct small pronunciation mistakes, especially when a foreigner is trying to speak English. However, That's exactly what some of the French did. On one occasion I asked where the nearest patisserie was, and instead of an answer, I got a long grammar lesson from an elderly, grumpy woman, who, by the way, wasn't even the worst. The truly rude French people simply ignored me, turned away, and said something like, "Sorry, I don't speak English," even though I had asked the question in reasonably good French. Over time, I stopped letting the irritation of some French people bother me. The truth is, there were plenty of kind people who made it worthwhile, and that helped me focus on the main purpose of the trip, expanding my knowledge of history by visiting various sites and consulting primary sources. In a small, charming town called Suresnes, my class visited a war cemetery dedicated to the American soldiers who lost their lives defending Europe against the relentless German war machine led by the Kaiser. This was an American cemetery where more than 6,000 soldiers were buried in areas marked by the letters A through D. With the sky covered by clouds of a metallic grey tone, we silently walked between the rows of immaculate white crosses, each representing an American who crossed the Atlantic on a modern crusade, but never returned to tell their story. That's when I saw a man in uniform standing on a well-kept lawn that, curiously, had no visible graves. That area was called Lot E. Strangely, this lot didn't appear on the plastic map that showed the layout of the graves. There was no mention of it in the visitor's guide, nor in the English brochures, nor on the cemetery's website. It was as if this lot simply didn't exist. Officially, it didn't. As I walked toward the man in uniform, I noticed he was wearing old military attire, the typical olive green uniform of World War II. I assumed he was some kind of tour guide or maybe a historical reenactor. That's when I started to notice the markers, 96 small white plaques the size of a business card containing only identification numbers. No names, no birthplaces, just small numbers that seemed more like filing records than anything with a trace of humanity. Unlike the other lots, there were no American flags flying, nothing to indicate that these were American soldiers. It was all very sad, and I wondered why these graves were treated with such indifference, but I soon got my answer. "Buried with their backs to the other lots," said the man in a somber tone. "These are the dishonored dead." He noticed my expression of surprise and continued, "These were American soldiers dishonorably discharged before being executed for crimes like assault or the murder of European civilians." "Oh, I see. And whose grave is this?" I asked, pointing to the white plaque near him. "Ah, this one," he replied with a slight smile, though his grey eyes showed sadness. "This grave belongs to a soldier with criminal tendencies, caught hunting on the rural property of an English nobleman. There was an argument, and the aristocrat was shot dead. The soldier was a man from Pennsylvania named Hunter Smith. Then things started to fall into place. Just like the soldier Jasper Till," the man added, "a black soldier executed for his alleged involvement in the murder of an Italian woman. Jasper Till, that name sounds very familiar, but for terrible reasons." "Exactly," he nodded. "The father of Emmett Till hanged on foreign soil when his son was just 3 years old, a tragic foreshadowing of Emmett's own death only 11 years later." I simply couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was the same Emmett Till, the boy whose mother chose an open casket funeral so the world could see the horror of his final moments. I imagine how she must have felt, realizing that she had lost both her husband and her son in the same brutal way. Both destroyed by false accusations, embraced with such violence that her loved ones were ripped from their lives by acts they didn't even commit. How did she manage to endure it? How would anyone endure that? It was exactly as the man had said. It seemed like a foreshadowing, as if Emmett's fate had been sealed years before, terribly intertwined with that of his father. This is, without a doubt, the most terrifying fact I've ever had to confront, and it made me question my entire worldview, wondering if, in the end, there really is some sort of plan, be it divine or malevolent, guiding these events. Perhaps, just perhaps, some people are indeed destined to suffer, condemned by something beyond our understanding. Since ancient times, when the first humans began walking the earth, there arose a need for a place to honor our dead. Whether in the sky burial rituals performed by Native American peoples, or in the ceremonies where the Vikings placed their dead on burning ships, humanity has always developed complex ways of dealing with the loss of those we love. Moreover, we feel the need for a place where we can remember them. With the arrival of the modern era, what we now know as cemeteries or graveyards emerged, where burial and marking became common practices. These spaces are steeped in a strong sense of mortality, surrounded by deep respect. Some might even call them sacred. For many, however, these places bring little comfort, and their association with death has made them an ideal setting for both ancient and modern horror stories. Honestly, I can't imagine a worse place to meet a tragic end. That was the sad fate of Jessica Lynn Keene, a 15-year-old girl from Columbus, Ohio. Jessica was described as an exemplary student and a lovely companion, according to her friends. With excellent grades, a result of her dedication to her studies and a contagious passion she brought to her activities as a cheerleader. However, as she entered adolescence, something changed in Jessica, and not in the usual mild, rebellious way common to that age. She became reckless, self-destructive, and worryingly uncontrollable. Jessica quickly quit her cheerleading activities, stopped hanging out with her usual friends, and her teachers began noticing her lack of focus in class. As a result, her grades plummeted drastically. After many conversations, her parents concluded that their daughter's problematic behavior was related to her boyfriend, an 18-year-old from Ohio named Sean Thompson. There was no doubt that Sean was a bad influence, as he was the one who introduced Jessica to alcohol and cigarettes, things she had avoided her entire life until then. The couple spent their nights together, going to rock concerts and frequenting bars until they were kicked out for being underage. Jessica started coming home later and later, often drunk. Her school routine was affected by her difficulty waking up early, which further harmed her attendance. Her parents, desperate, tried everything to get her back on track, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, they decided to take drastic action, and on March 4, 1991, they involuntarily committed her to a center for troubled teens. However, as expected, Jessica had no intention of staying there. Soon, she began planning her escape. On a cold March night, she took advantage of a moment of distraction from the staff and slipped out of the building discreetly, taking only a small bag with some belongings. Her parents were furious with the facility's staff, accusing them of negligence for allowing her escape. They immediately filed a report with the Ohio police, emphasizing their daughter's vulnerable status to expedite the search. The police contacted Sean Thompson, Jessica's occasional boyfriend, who lived a few hundred miles away. The main hypothesis was that Jessica would try to return to central Ohio to reunite with Sean. However, when they arrived at his house, the police discovered that Jessica wasn't there, and worse, Sean was completely unaware of her escape. That's when the Columbus authorities realized the seriousness of the case. Unfortunately, after only 2 days missing, Jessica Keene's lifeless body was found near the Foster Chapel Cemetery, located just over 30 kilometers from the teen center where she had been committed. Jessica had been brutally assaulted and beaten, and she was found without her clothes. The ring she wore was still on her finger, but a pendant with the word "taken" that she usually carried was missing. Tragically, the prime suspect in the murder was initially her boyfriend Sean. However, the DNA technology available at the time showed that he wasn't responsible. The Columbus police theorized that Jessica, after escaping the facility, tried to hitchhike back home as she didn't have money for a bus ticket. At some point, 2 men approached her offering a ride. Whether because Jessica had a bad initial impression or changed her mind along the way, something made her decide to run. What is known is that a foot chase ensued, forcing Jessica to run toward the Foster Chapel Cemetery, where the tragic end took place. Investigators found evidence at the cemetery showing how Jessica desperately tried to hide behind headstones. One of her socks was located, along with a mark in the mud, behind one of these gravestones. Nearby, her body was found next to a fence where her pursuers presumably caught up with her and killed her. In memory of Jessica, a headstone was placed at that exact spot in the cemetery, marking the place of her tragic death. On April 9, 2008, Marvin Lee Smith Jr. was arrested by Burlington, North Carolina, police after authorities linked his DNA to the crime. Smith was charged with the unlawful assault of Jessica Keene, which led to his rapid extradition to Ohio. Shockingly, in 2009, Smith confessed to his involvement in Jessica's murder in a Madison County courtroom. According to his account, Jessica fled from his car and ran to the Foster Chapel Cemetery where she collided with a fence. Smith admitted that after Jessica fell, he beat her to death with a headstone before throwing her body over a nearby fence. Evidence such as blood-stained fragments of a headstone was indeed found by police at the location Smith indicated. Thanks to his confession, Smith avoided the death penalty at the trial, which was set for March 2009. He ultimately pleaded guilty to aggravated murder with specifications of desecration and was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Sadly, we can only imagine the terror in Jessica Lynn Keene's final moments, fatally pursued in a place steeped in the concept of death, only to be brutally murdered with an object that symbolizes mortality itself. The Grim Reaper certainly seems to have a cruel and twisted sense of humor. It seems that many people have been asking for mysterious stories involving cemeteries, and I have something interesting to share. I'm from Hong Kong and work at Pok Fullam Cemetery, which is one of the most crowded cemeteries in the world. Founded in 1882, this private cemetery is located on the western side of Hong Kong Island, and its appearance is simply stunning. Even having lived here all my life, I've never fully gotten used to its grandeur. The cemetery is built in terraces like steps on the mountainside, with staircases connecting the different areas, making it look like a large open-air amphitheater. The story I want to tell begins just before a festival called Qingming, also known as the Tomb Sweeping Day. This festival, which takes place in early April, dates back 2,000 years to the Han Dynasty. On this day, families go to the graves of their loved ones to clean them as a sign of respect for their ancestors, showing that they are still remembered and prayed for. Additionally, it's a matter of prestige, as well-kept graves reflect the family's honor and status. Because the cemetery is extremely crowded, with some families paying over $30,000 for the privilege of being buried there, some years require a lot of work before the family visits, and that work isn't always pleasant. In April of last year, I was assigned the task of relocating some remains to new graves to make room for those who had paid considerable amounts for the best burial spots. I had never done this before, and honestly, I was quite apprehensive. Aside from the cultural taboo of disturbing someone's remains, this was apparently one of the most difficult and exhausting tasks that I or any of my colleagues had ever faced. On the dampest days of the year, wearing multiple layers of protective gear, those of us assigned to the task had to be extremely careful. We moved remains up and down hundreds of steps, without losing a single fragment of bone or dust. And so, early one morning, I put on my masks, goggles, and forensic suit. We have a term for this in Cantonese, but that's the best translation, and began my work. I spent 8 hours just breaking the seal of the tomb because it's not enough to move the remains. We have to transfer the entire tomb, ensuring that every piece remains intact and undamaged. This tomb was very old and in terrible condition. The deceased's family had easily accepted the money offered by a wealthier family, and with that amount, they could either refurbish the tomb or keep the money for themselves, which seemed unlikely. The name on the tombstone was almost illegible, worn away by the passage of time. I hoped the money would help improve its condition. The next day, it was time to bag the remains. It was meticulous work, gathering the bones one by one after breaking open the wooden coffin, which was already in an advanced state of decay. As I did this, I realized how this task forces you to confront your own mortality. Working daily in a cemetery, Monday through Friday, makes you think about death, but at the same time, the routine activities of maintenance and cleaning end up distracting you, making the theme of death more distant, almost imperceptible. However, that distance becomes impossible when you come face to face with the remains of another human being. Handling the bones of someone who had died so long ago was a disturbing experience. Separating each piece and placing them in the proper plastic bag made me see a human being reduced to their most basic parts, like a disassembled toy that could never be put back together. It made me think about our fragility, how our lives are temporary and fleeting. Part of us persists long after death, but not necessarily the parts we would want. Now, I should say that I don't believe in supernatural or paranormal phenomena. I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation for what happened to me during that time, but it's an explanation I haven't yet discovered. You see, on the nights after I started these tasks, I began having very strange dreams. I was at the cemetery as usual when I was approached by a young woman who seemed to be visiting her ancestors' graves. She was very beautiful, tall by Hong Kong standards, and she wore a very traditional Chinese outfit, different from the Western clothes that are much more common here, especially among young people like me. The dream was so vivid that when I woke up, her name was on the tip of my tongue, Lian Kei. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the dream, and it kept repeating for a few nights, like an endless cycle. The week went by and I kept dreaming about her, but I tried not to give it too much importance. However, everything changed when it was time to restore the engravings and repaint the tombstone. We had to resort to old handwritten records to find out who was buried in that lot. They were huge, dusty books taken from the back of some forgotten vault. If it weren't for the meticulous organization of these archives, our work would have taken much longer to complete. However, when I reached the page of the remains I had exhumed, something made me think I had made a mistake. The first words I read were the surname Li, followed by the name Yan. Immediately, I remembered the dreams I had been having where a beautiful girl greeted me while visiting her family's graves. I grew uneasy as I read the next name, desperately hoping it wouldn't be Kei. Thankfully, it wasn't. The full name was Li Yanfeng. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. It was still too big of a coincidence that the surname and middle name of the girl in my dreams were the same as the deceased person's. After we moved the remains and sealed the tomb, the dreams began to fade. Lian Kei no longer appeared in my nights. I still don't know why I had those dreams, but I believe it was just my mind trying to cope with the stress of the meticulous and tense process of moving someone's remains. Even so, every time I try to rationalize it, I can't shake the feeling of fear and unease that it caused me. I was the director of a funeral home. Let me give you a quick introduction. The cemetery where I work has a long history, at least a century old. The nearby church, built in the 17th century, helps indicate its age. Since this is a rural area, it was common in the past for people to be buried with only simple wooden crosses, without the use of marble or stone. Over time, these crosses rotted and deteriorated, and new burials occurred repeatedly. Today, with fewer residents in the region, our budget has also been cut, leaving the cemetery worn and overgrown with weeds. The place, despite its beauty, carries a melancholic atmosphere. It's not hard to imagine that after centuries of using the same patch of land for burials, the soil has been turned over countless times, to the point of being saturated with bone fragments. Rarely can you work on the flower beds without coming across teeth or bone pieces, which may seem grim. That's basically it. Fragments of skeletons scattered all around, just beneath a thin layer of grass. The soil resembles what you'd find near sandy beaches, but when you look closely, the pale particles you see aren't shells, but small bits of crushed bone. It's not particularly scary, nor exactly unexpected. Over time, you get used to it and learn to treat any human remains with respect, simply covering them with the plant you're tending to. So, someone was tending to their family's grave and decided to enlarge the space around it. Around here, people don't like grass much. They prefer a smooth ground, with rake patterns in the style of a Zen garden. As the person removed the grass and worked the area, they ended up pulling a tuft of white hair from the ground. I imagine they panicked and ran off, leaving the cemetery attendant to deal with what was essentially hair emerging from the earth. The case was brought to the church, and it seems the remains were reburied. Despite all my years working in funerals, I can't say how the body could have been so close to the surface. However, there's another event that marked me even more. My business partner and I had just returned to the funeral home after attending to a call for a 27-year-old woman who tragically lost her battle with terminal cancer. As we were moving her body from the stretcher to the embalming table, we heard a click, and the radio on the other side of the room turned on by itself, blasting loud static. It was one of those old radios where you have to turn the volume dial until you hear a click to turn it on. We looked at each other, both pale. He was very religious, and the incident clearly shook him. Not long after, he found an excuse to leave early. I turned off the radio as I usually listened to music on my iPhone while doing the embalming. Later, when I finished the work and was trying to move the body to the dressing table, I heard the same click, and the radio turned on again, this time with the volume at maximum. By then I was really spooked and decided to leave right after. We never spoke about it again, and as far as I know, nothing like it ever happened before or after that. I spend a lot of time in the cemetery in my town. It might seem strange, but it's a place full of history and cultural significance. To be honest, sometimes it's more comfortable to be among the dead than the living. What intrigues me the most about this particular cemetery is a small, somewhat isolated area where many old graves are marked only by 3-digit numbers. I'm not sure how many there are, but I've seen numbers that go beyond 300. Some of these graves have small flags placed beside them, indicating that they belong to veterans of foreign wars. However, none of them have names or dates, just the numbers. I've never understood why these people were buried without identity, but I imagine they are the bodies of people whose names couldn't be identified. It must be terrible to be forgotten by history in such a way, with a nameless grave. Near this area, there's a different grave. It has a name, birth and death dates, and the place of birth, all written in Greek. Once I used a translation app on my phone and found out that the person was born far away, in Leucadia, Greece. Curiously, the name and place of birth are the same as another grave, also in Greek, located on the other side of the cemetery. What's even stranger is that while the birth dates vary from 1900 to 1983, the date of death is the same for all. Hundreds of people died on the same day. Just like with the unnamed graves, I've never been able to find out what happened there, even after much research, as Google didn't provide any answers. There's also a grave in one of the newer sections of the cemetery, filled with notes left by the wife of the man buried there. And it's not just one note. Some days, there are hundreds of them, small post-its scattered all over the grave. Most have just a few words written hurriedly and almost illegibly, as if this woman is always coming back to continue conversations with her husband who's already gone. Or maybe it's his sister, but that's one of those things I'll probably never figure out. Also, I've witnessed some odd things while walking around there, alone among the graves. Just to be clear, I don't believe in ghosts. I'm an agnostic. I don't have much faith in this idea of God that people usually have, that figure of an old man with a white beard, like an omnipotent Santa Claus. But I do believe there are things we simply can't explain yet, just like how, in ancient times, scientists couldn't understand why the sun seemed to revolve around the earth. For example, it's happened more than once that I've been looking at a grave, noticing the morbid details on the tombstone, when suddenly a bird lands right there on the stone or the grave itself. I've also seen cats meowing and scratching at the air as if they're staring intently at something invisible to me. Of course, there must be a logical explanation for all of this, but thinking too much about these things while walking through the cemetery can make the walk a little intense, to say the least. Before we move on to the last story, if you're still here, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on today's stories. Or, if you prefer, let us know what time you're watching. Well, let's continue. I still have a very clear memory of the night my father passed away. It feels like it was just yesterday. I was almost about to leave for my shift at the bar where I worked as an assistant manager. I was finishing up an episode of The Sopranos when my phone rang. For some reason, I thought it was someone from work calling, maybe asking me to come in early or something trivial, so I hesitated to answer. When I did pick up, I was completely relaxed. If I had to describe that moment with one emotion, it would be apathy, though that feeling would quickly disappear. The news came as a shock. He had passed away suddenly, unexpectedly, due to some kind of clot in his brain. One minute he was fine and cheerful, and the next he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. The funeral was painful. It might sound cruel to say, but when a loved one is elderly or suffering from a terminal illness, at least family and friends have time to prepare, to anticipate the loss. In our case, we didn't get that chance. It was as if life went from 0 to 100 in seconds, from indifference to devastation in the time it took to hear, "I have bad news." Unlike the resigned acceptance I had seen at previous funerals, what I felt this time was shock, as if we had all been hit twice, wandering around, unable to fully absorb what we had lost. I've never been one to visit graves either. It might sound insensitive, but what's the point? These rituals are always for the living. The dead aren't aware of them. And honestly, I'd like to be remembered, of course, but a visitation ritual that only brings up feelings of mortality and impermanence? I'd rather someone raise a glass of beer for me, and that's all I want when I'm gone. But when it came to my father, I was left without any real sense of closure. That led me to go against all my previous beliefs, searching for something to hold on to, craving the feeling that he was somehow still there. The visits that started weekly became monthly, and they always followed the same pattern. I would bring a can of his favorite beer to his grave, talk a bit about what was going on in my life. It never truly made me feel better, but each time I walked away, I felt like I was taking small steps in the grieving process. It was a small relief, but it helped. So I kept the ritual, repeating it the same way, until the day I noticed a stranger near where he was buried. The man was dressed entirely in black with a long coat and a dark umbrella tucked under his arm. It wasn't clear whether he was visiting my father's grave or someone nearby, but as soon as I approached, he saw me. He quickly began to move away from the headstones, heading toward one of the cemetery's exits. At that point, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, right? People have the right to grieve in private, and I respected that, so I didn't think much of it. But then it happened again exactly the same way. The second time, I still considered it a coincidence. But when that second time turned into a third, and I saw the same man standing between the graves again, I began to think something strange was going on. On the third occasion, I tried to approach quietly, walking as silently as possible. I wanted to find out if he was really visiting my father's grave and not just one of the nearby ones. That's when I realized he was. I watched from a distance as he knelt near the headstone, running his hand over it. For a moment, I didn't recognize him from the funeral. Though I couldn't see his face clearly, I knew for sure he wasn't someone familiar, not even someone I'd met casually before. Curiosity took over, and I decided to find out what was going on. I kept quiet, walking lightly and silently as I got closer and closer. But just as I came into view, he turned, saw me, and his eyes showed pure shock. Suddenly, he started running in the opposite direction, weaving between the graves toward the exit. Instinctively, I ran after him. At that moment, it was either that or accept that I might never get another chance. If I didn't catch him now, he might never come back to my father's grave, and I'd once again be left with no answers, no closure. I couldn't let that happen again. That's how I found myself sprinting after someone in the middle of a cemetery, yelling for him to stop, trying to explain that I just wanted to talk. Some of the few people who were there looked at me with shock and disapproval, unable to believe that anyone could be so disrespectful in a place where their loved ones rested. But honestly, I didn't care at all. I knew that if they were in my situation, they'd do exactly the same. I caught up to him near one of the cemetery's exits, managing to grab his arm, pulling him with enough force that he spun around from his own momentum. What I saw next made my stomach turn. The face partially covered by the black scarf was my father's face. The resemblance was striking in every detail. The only difference was in his behavior, small gestures, posture, body language. It was all different from what I remembered. When he spoke, I felt completely disoriented. My father was from southern England, and his accent had always reflected that. But this man spoke with a strong Scottish accent, or at least that's what it sounded like. Either way, it wasn't my father. He told me to leave him alone before running off again, and, strange as it sounds, I obeyed. My legs were weak, not just because of the sudden sprint that I, never an athletic person, had somehow endured. I couldn't move, let alone chase him. Later, after talking to my mom, the only conclusion we could reach was that this man must be my father's identical twin brother. After all, she had identified his body at the morgue. There was no way he had faked his death or any of the conspiracy theories I initially suggested. But, as my mom mentioned, he had never mentioned having a brother, much less a twin. This is something we're going to investigate because if this man is who we think, a long-lost brother of my father, I really want to find him as soon as possible. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to be alerted for all future stories. I post new videos here every day. Hope to see you in the next one. Now I'll leave 2 other great videos on the screen that I know you'll enjoy. See you there.